Imagine a city not of light, but of shadow. A place where the very cobblestones of its historic streets seemed to whisper secrets of a different kind of American history. This is Boston, in the middle of the 20th century, a city of sharp contrasts, where the polished world of politics and academia coexisted, often uneasily, with a brutal and deeply entrenched underworld. It was a world governed by its own strict codes, a world where loyalty was currency and violence was the final arbitrator of all disputes. And into this world, on a cold February day in 1929, was born a man who would not just navigate these treacherous waters, but would come to command them. A man whose name would become synonymous with a particular brand of organized crime in New England. His name was Howard Winter, but to the police, the press, and the countless associates who both respected and feared him, he would be known as Howie, the quiet kingpin of the Winter Hill Gang. His story is not one of flamboyant, public notoriety, but rather a masterclass in the power of operating from the shadows, of building an empire not on bombast, but on calculated silence and strategic alliances. It is a chronicle of rise, dominion, and the inescapable gravity of a downfall, a tale woven from the very fabric of a city's dark side. To understand Howie Winter is to understand a fundamental truth about power itself, that its most durable form is often the one you hear the least about, until it is too late. This is his story, a narrative pieced together from countless sources, court documents, and FBI files, and the whispered legacies of those who were there, presented not to glorify, but to inform, to provide a clear-eyed look into a life lived outside the law. So settle in, and let us journey back to the beginning, to the streets of Somerville, Massachusetts, where a young boy was about to learn the rules of the only game this city truly respected. The most shocking part of this story is not any single act of violence, but the sheer scale of the criminal enterprise he built, an operation that, for a time, functioned as a dark mirror to the legitimate economy of an entire region. This is the story of Howie Winter, the Boston kingpin. The soil from which Howard Winter grew was the hardscrabble, working class neighborhood of Somerville, a city pressed tightly against Boston's northern border. In the decades following his birth in 1929, Somerville was not the revitalized, trendy hub it would later become. It was a dense tapestry of immigrant families, predominantly Irish and Italian, all struggling for a piece of the post-war American dream, a dream that for many remained frustratingly out of reach. This environment, where everyone knew everyone else's business and where loyalty to your block, your street, and your people was the paramount virtue, was the perfect incubator for a certain type of ambition. The legitimate paths to success often seemed long, arduous, and stacked with obstacles for boys with certain last names and addresses. But the illegitimate paths, the shortcuts that ran through the back alleys and social clubs, they offered a much faster, albeit far more dangerous, route to respect and financial independence. Young Howie would have seen this world with crystal clarity. He would have watched the local bookie operating with near impunity, the small-time hoods who commanded a certain fear and respect on the corner, the ward politicians who owed their positions to the street, level operatives who could reliably deliver votes. This was his education, far more impactful than anything learned in a schoolroom. It was here that he learned the foundational lesson of his life, that power was not an abstract concept, but a very tangible thing, built on a combination of fear, favor, and a ruthless understanding of human weakness. He wasn't a loud or flashy youth. His power, even in these early days, was in his quiet observation, his ability to listen more than he spoke, to calculate rather than react impulsively. This demeanor set him apart. While others were getting into drunken brawls or drawing unnecessary attention to themselves with petty crimes, Howie was learning the chessboard, not just how to move the pieces, but how to control the entire game from a position of seeming detachment. His first forays into the criminal world were likely modest, almost apprentice-like. Running numbers, acting as a lookout, doing small collection jobs for local loan sharks. These were the entry-level positions in the corporate ladder of the underworld. And in this world, Howie Winter was a fast, rising executive. He understood that the small-time operations, the street-level gambling and loans, were the lifeblood of the larger system. They generated consistent, untraceable cash, and more importantly, they created a network of dependencies, a web of people who owed you favors, who feared your reprisal, or who simply relied on the service you provided. This network was the true source of power, more valuable than any single haul from a bank robbery. It was during this period that he began to form the alliances that would define his career, crossing paths with other ambitious young men from the greater Boston area, individuals like James Buddy McLean and Edward Wimpy Bennett, names that would soon become legendary and infamous in their own right. These relationships, forged in the crucible of street-level crime, were the building blocks of what would eventually become the most powerful criminal syndicate in New England, an organization that would not have a flashy name like the Mafia, but would be known simply and ominously by the nondescript hill in Somerville where it planted its flag, the Winter Hill Gang. The path to power in the Boston underworld was never a peaceful one, and for Howie Winter, his ascent was catalyzed by a period of brutal, internecine conflict that would come to be known as the Irish Gang War, a bloody chapter that pitted rival factions against each other in a struggle for ultimate dominance. This wasn't a war fought on distant battlefields with organized armies. It was a savage, intimate conflict fought in the dimly lit bars, the deserted parking lots, and the quiet residential streets of Charlestown and Somerville. The initial fault lines were often personal, insults and vendettas that spiraled out of control, but the underlying cause was always the same: control over the lucrative criminal enterprises of the region. The key figure, who emerged as both a rival and a tragic figure in this narrative, was Bernard McLaughlin, a member of the powerful McLaughlin clan from Charlestown. The conflict ignited from a seemingly minor dispute, a personal affront that the rigid codes of honor in this world could not overlook. Buddy McLean, a close associate of Winter's, and a formidable force in his own right, found himself in a deadly feud with the McLaughlins. What followed was a series of retaliatory killings that dragged the entire criminal landscape of Boston into a vortex of violence. Howie Winter, by virtue of his alliance with McLean, was squarely in the middle of it. This war was the ultimate test of his philosophy. While others were driven by rage and a thirst for vengeance, Winter's approach was strategic. He understood that survival and ultimate victory depended not on emotional reactions, but on cold, calculated decisions. He became a key strategist and a reliable, deadly ally to McLean. The violence was shocking in its audacity and brutality. Men were gunned down in broad daylight. Ambushes were laid with military precision, and the city was gripped by a fear that was both palpable and unspoken. The police seemed powerless to stop the cycle of murder. It was during this time that Howie Winter's reputation was forged in fire. He was not a reckless triggerman, though he was certainly capable of violence. His value lay in his mind, his ability to plan, to anticipate the moves of his enemies, and to manage the logistics of a shadow war. He was a master of intelligence, understanding that knowing where your enemy would be and who he trusted was more valuable than sheer firepower. The war reached its grim crescendo with the deaths of several key McLaughlin members, and, tragically, the murder of Buddy McLean himself in 1965, an event that sent shockwaves through the entire structure. With McLean gone, a power vacuum was created, and it was at this precise moment that Howie Winter's years of quiet calculation, his network of alliances, and his proven reliability positioned him as the natural successor. He didn't seize power through a dramatic, violent coup. He simply stepped into the void, consolidating the various factions that had been loyal to McLean and merging them with his own operations. The end of the Irish gang war did not mean the end of violence, but it did signal a consolidation of power. The chaotic, multi-factional conflict was over, and in its place stood a more organized, more disciplined, and far more powerful entity, the Winter Hill Gang, now under the steady, unflinching leadership of Howie Winter. The era of the loose confederation was over. The era of the corporate-style criminal syndicate had begun. With the bloody turf wars receding into a grisly memory, the landscape of the Boston underworld had been irrevocably altered, and Howie Winter stood at its apex, not as a flamboyant dictator, but as its chief executive officer. The Winter Hill Gang, now a consolidated power, moved from the chaotic violence of street-level disputes to a period of unprecedented expansion and sophisticated criminal enterprise. Their headquarters was not a fortified compound, but a seemingly innocuous place, Marshall's Auto Body in Somerville. This garage became the nerve center of New England's crime, a place where deals were struck, money was laundered, and the gang's business was conducted with a chilling semblance of normalcy. It was here that Winter perfected his model of organized crime, one that mirrored a legitimate corporation in its structure and diversification. The core of their empire remained the ancient vices gambling and loansharking. But under Winter's management, these were not small-time operations. The gang's bookmaking network was vast, a complex web that stretched across state lines, taking bets on everything from professional sports to local political races. This operation generated a river of cash, a river that needed to be managed, laundered, and reinvested. Loansharking, or shellocking, was the other pillar. They provided high interest loans to individuals who had no access to traditional banks. Gamblers in deep with their bookies, small business owners facing a temporary crunch, or simply desperate people making desperate choices. The enforcement of these debts was where the gang's violent reputation was kept as a quiet, implicit threat, a tool used not for show, but for business efficiency. But Winter's true genius lay in his diversification. He understood that to build a lasting empire, he needed to move beyond traditional street crimes. He saw opportunity in the world of horse racing, orchestrating a sophisticated race-fixing scheme at New England racetracks. This involved bribing jockeys, tampering with horses, and manipulating the odds in a way that guaranteed massive, risk-free payouts for the gang. It was a complex operation that required coordination, silence, and a deep understanding of the sport, demonstrating the gang's elevated ambitions. Furthermore, Winter and his associates, most notably the rising and notoriously volatile figures like James, Whitey, Bulger, and Stephen, the Rifleman, Flemmy, moved into the lucrative world of labor racketeering. They infiltrated unions, using the threat of violence to extort money from businesses and to control key sectors, like the waterfront and construction. This granted them not just financial leverage, but also political influence, as the ability to control unions meant the ability to sway elections and buy protection. Another surprising venture was their foray into professional boxing promotions. Winter, a known fight fan, used his influence and his capital to promote fights in the Boston area, a move that allowed him to rub shoulders with celebrities and legitimate businessmen, further blurring the lines between his two worlds and providing yet another avenue for laundering money. This period, stretching through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, was the golden age of the Winter Hill Gang. They were not just criminals, they were a shadow government, a parallel economy. They operated with a brazenness that was fueled by a perceived invincibility, an invincibility built on a foundation of corruption, fear, and a network of informants that reached into the very heart of law enforcement. The cash flowed endlessly, and Howie Winter, the quiet man from Somerville, now presided over an empire that was as vast as it was invisible to the general public, an empire built not on a throne, but from a stool in an auto repair shop. The operational genius of the Winter Hill Gang under Howie Winter was rooted in a business-like structure that prioritized profit and stability over brute force. Yet it was this very structure that began to attract the relentless, methodical attention of federal law enforcement. While the gang's activities were diverse, their daily operations ran with a chilling efficiency. The lifeblood of the organization was its bookmaking operation, a sophisticated network that functioned like a dark version of a corporate call center. Bettors would place their wagers through a hierarchy of agents who would then layer the bets up the chain, eventually consolidating them at Marshall's Auto Body. Here, specialists known as sheet writers would meticulously record every wager, calculating the odds and the potential liability on any given game. The goal was not to gamble, but to broker risk, ensuring a profit regardless of the outcome by adjusting point spreads and balancing the action on both sides. This required a deep understanding of mathematics and probability, a far cry from the image of thuggish enforcers. The massive cash generated, often hundreds of thousands of dollars a week, posed a significant logistical challenge: how to transform this illicit, dirty money into clean, usable capital. This is where the gang's foray into legitimate, seeming businesses became crucial. Ventures like the auto body shop, vending machine companies, and boxing promotions were not just for show. They were essential components of a money laundering apparatus. They would commingle the illegal gambling profits with the legitimate business revenues, creating falsified records and invoices that could be presented to banks and the IRS, effectively washing the money and making it appear as earned income. This financial sophistication was what set Winter's organization apart from its predecessors. However, the human element within this corporate facade remained volatile and would ultimately become its greatest vulnerability. The inclusion of James, Whitey, Bulger and his partner Stephen, the rifleman, Flemmy into the Winter Hill orbit was a strategic decision, one that would have catastrophic long-term consequences. Bulger, who led his own South Boston-based crew, was brought in as a key lieutenant. His reputation for ruthless efficiency and his control over the lucrative Southie territory made him a valuable asset. But Bulger was a different kind of criminal than Winter. He was more paranoid, more visibly vicious, and harbored ambitions that stretched beyond being a mere lieutenant. This alliance, while powerful, also created a dangerous tension within the gang's upper echelon. It was during this period of peak power that the first major cracks began to appear, not from street-level rivals, but from the organized might of the federal government. The FBI, through its Boston field office, had launched a dedicated effort to dismantle the Winter Hill Gang. Their initial focus was on the gang's most visible and prosecutable weak point, its gambling operations. Using traditional investigative methods like physical surveillance, wiretaps, and the tracking of financial transactions, agents began to painstakingly map the entire organization. They followed collectors, identified sheet writers, and monitored the flow of cash to and from Marshall's Auto Body. This was a slow, meticulous process, building a case brick by brick. But the most significant threat to Winter and his empire came from a direction they believed was impervious: the inside. Unbeknownst to Winter, his new associate, Whitey Bulger, had already begun a secret relationship with the FBI, formalized in 1975. Bulger and Flemmy were recruited as top echelon informants, providing the FBI with information on the activities of their rivals, particularly the Italian mafia in Boston's North End, in exchange for protection and a virtual license to operate their own criminal enterprises without interference. This created a devastating paradox. While the FBI was building a case against Howie Winter, they were simultaneously protecting one of his most powerful and dangerous allies, effectively blinding themselves to the full scope of the gang's activities and allowing Bulger to consolidate his own power under the shield of the federal government. The stage was being set for a downfall, not from a dramatic shootout, but from a slow, creeping legal stranglehold and the profound betrayal festering at the very heart of his organization. The federal news around the Winter Hill Gang began to tighten with a relentless, bureaucratic precision that was far more dangerous than any rival gang's threat. The initial focus, as with so many prosecutions of organized crime figures, was not on murder or extortion, but on taxes. The IRS's intelligence division became a key player, recognizing that while violence could be difficult to prove in court, financial trails were often indelible. Agents pored over the gang's known business interests, searching for discrepancies, for large cash deposits that couldn't be explained, for lifestyles that far exceeded reported incomes. They looked at the houses Winter and his associates owned, the cars they drove, the vacations they took, and they began to construct a paper trail that would prove the gang's immense, untaxed income. This financial investigation ran parallel to the FBI's pursuit of the gang's core racketeering activities. The break that federal prosecutors desperately needed came from a seemingly unrelated case hundreds of miles away, the investigation into the fixing of sporting events at Boston College. While the BC case focused on basketball, the methods and the characters involved opened a window into the wider world of sports corruption, a world where the Winter Hill Gang was a significant player. Federal investigators, led by determined prosecutors and FBI agents, began to flip lower-level members of the organization. These were not the hardened core like Winter or Bulger, but bookmakers, drivers, and money couriers who, when faced with the prospect of decades in federal prison, chose to cooperate. They provided the intimate details of the gang's daily operations, the locations of the wire rooms, the codes used for communication, the structure of the layering system for bets, and the identities of the sheet writers. This insider information was devastating, as it allowed prosecutors to give context to the thousands of hours of surveillance and the complex financial records they had compiled. The most significant threat, however, materialized in the form of a federal grand jury. This secretive body, operating out of a courthouse, had the power to subpoena witnesses and documents, compelling testimony under oath. Members and associates of the Winter Hill Gang were summoned one by one to testify. This was a critical moment. They faced an impossible choice: perjure themselves by lying to the grand jury and face immediate charges for perjury, or tell the truth and implicate themselves and their associates in a vast racketeering conspiracy. The pressure was immense and unyielding. It was during this period that the gang's facade of invincibility began to visibly crack. The very sophistication that had been their strength, their corporate structure, their detailed record keeping, now became a liability, creating a vast archive of evidence for prosecutors to use against them. Meanwhile, the secret arrangement between Whitey Bulger and his FBI handler, John Connolly, created a surreal and deeply corrupt dynamic. Connolly, a South Boston native who saw Bulger as both an asset and a friend, actively protected Bulger and Flemmy. He would warn them about ongoing investigations, the identities of potential informants, and the focus of the grand jury, allowing them to evade scrutiny and, chillingly, to eliminate those who they believed might be cooperating. This protection meant that as the legal storm clouds gathered, they gathered almost exclusively over Howie Winter's head, while his most dangerous subordinate operated with a sense of security granted by the very agency tasked with destroying them. Winter, the calm and calculating strategist, now found himself in a fight he could not control through intimidation or alliance. He was playing a legal game with rules set by the state, and the evidence, witness by witness, document by document, was stacking up against him. The empire he had built so carefully was being dismantled not with a bang, but with a quiet, methodical turning of pages in a grand jury room and the meticulous entries in an accountant's ledger. The culmination of years of painstaking investigation arrived not with a rheumatic raid, but with the formal, legal pronouncement of a federal indictment. In 1978, Howie Winter, along with several of his top lieutenants, was charged with a litany of crimes that read like a blueprint for his entire criminal empire. The charges included racketeering under the RICO Act, a powerful and relatively new statute designed specifically to combat organized crime by allowing prosecutors to target an entire enterprise, illegal gambling, loansharking, and conspiracy. The indictment was a sweeping document that laid bare the inner workings of the Winter Hill gang, detailing the race-fixing schemes, the nationwide bookmaking operation, and the systematic use of threats and violence to enforce its will. For Winter, this was the moment the Shadow War became a very public, very dire legal battle. The trial that followed was a spectacle, drawing intense media attention and laying bare the secrets of Boston's underworld for all to see. The courtroom became a stage where the two worlds, the legitimate and the criminal, violently collided. The prosecution's case was a formidable mountain of evidence, wiretap transcripts capturing cryptic conversations about bets and point spreads, financial records showing massive cash flows through shell corporations, and the seized, meticulously kept ledgers from Marshall's auto body that documented millions of dollars in wagers. But the most damning evidence came from the witnesses who took the stand. Former associates, now turned government informants to save themselves, provided the narrative that tied all the documentary evidence together. They pointed to Winter as the boss, the man in charge. They described his calm, commanding presence at the auto body shop, his approval needed for major decisions, and his share of the profits. They testified about the fear he commanded, not through overt threats, but through a quiet authority that everyone understood. The defense fought back, attempting to paint these witnesses as self-serving liars who would say anything to reduce their own prison sentences. They argued that Winter was simply a businessman, a partner in a legitimate auto repair shop, and that the government was criminalizing the act of gambling itself, persecuting a man for a vice that much of the public indulged in. They tried to separate Winter from the more violent acts attributed to the gang, presenting him as a figure from a bygone era, more interested in the business of betting than in strong arm tactics. But the evidence was simply too overwhelming, too interconnected. The prosecution successfully argued that the gambling was not a series of isolated acts, but the financial engine of a massive criminal conspiracy, a conspiracy that Winter led. They portrayed him not as a harmless bookie, but as the CEO of a corporation whose business was crime. After a tense deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict guilty on all counts. The conviction was a landmark victory for law enforcement and a devastating final blow to Howie Winter's reign. The quiet kingpin of Somerville, the man who had navigated the Irish gang war and built an empire from the ashes, had been brought down not by a rival's bullet, but by the weight of the federal law. In 1979, standing before a judge, Howard Winter was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. As he was led away, a new era was dawning in the Boston underworld. With Winter incarcerated, the balance of power shifted dramatically. The Winter Hill Gang, once a disciplined syndicate, was now leaderless. And into that power vacuum stepped the man who had been secretly protected from this very fate, the man whose ambitions had long simmered under the surface James, Whitey, Bulger. Winter's downfall was not just the end of a career. It was the end of an era of relative structure and the beginning of a new, more chaotic and personally predatory chapter in Boston's criminal history, all set in motion by the gavel of a federal judge. The clang of the prison gate closing behind Howie Winter signaled a profound and disorienting shift to becoming an architect of his own destiny, to becoming a number in a system designed to erase individuality. His new world was one of regimented routine, confined spaces, and constant surveillance, a stark contrast to the wide-reaching, albeit shadowy, influence he had commanded from his stool at Marshall's auto body, federal prison, especially for a man of his stature and age. He was 50 years old when he began his sentence. Was not merely an interruption of his life. It was a forced exile within the rigid social hierarchy of the penitentiary. Winter would have still commanded a certain respect. His reputation as the former boss of the Winter Hill Gang preceded him, affording him a degree of protection and deference from other inmates, a recognition that even in captivity, he was a man of significance. He was not a man to cause trouble or seek confrontation. His time would have been spent in the same quiet, observant manner that had characterized his life on the outside. But now his observations were limited to the microcosm of the prison yard. He would have maintained his physical discipline, likely spending hours lifting weights, and his mental sharpness through reading and correspondence. Yet, despite this external calm, the mind of a strategist like Winter would have been racing, constantly processing the information that trickled in from the outside world through visitors, letters, and clandestine communications. And the news from Boston was nothing short of catastrophic for the empire he had built. He learned of the rapid and brutal consolidation of power by Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmy. With Winter removed, the restraining influence he had provided was gone, and Bulger's more savage and paranoid instincts were unleashed. The gang's operations continued, but the corporate, like structure Winter had prized, began to decay, replaced by a regime built on pure terror. Bulger, insulated by his secret status as an FBI informant, operated with a brazenness that Winter would have found reckless and ultimately self-destructive. Winter would have heard the grim rumors of Bulger's escalating violence, the murders of those perceived as threats, the gruesome tales of bodies being exhumed and moved, the extortion of drug dealers that was far more overt and brutal than the gang's previous methods. He would have learned about the fate of those who had been close to him, men who were pushed out or eliminated by Bulger's inner circle. To Winter, a man who believed in the long game and the stability of the enterprise, Bulger's reign would have looked like a suicide march. It was the antithesis of everything he had worked to build. The gang was no longer a low-profile, profit-driven machine under Bulger. It was becoming a high-profile, violent spectacle, attracting the very kind of heat that Winter had always sought to avoid. Furthermore, the secret of Bulger's cooperation with the FBI, which would have been the ultimate betrayal in Winter's eyes, was still a closely guarded secret, known only to Bulger, Flemmy, and their handlers. From Winter's perspective in his prison cell, the chaos unfolding in Boston must have been both infuriating and deeply frustrating. He was powerless to stop it. He could only watch from a distance as his life's work was systematically dismantled and corrupted by the man he had once considered an ally. This period of incarceration was therefore not just a punishment for his crimes, but a personal purgatory, a time of forced reflection on the fragility of power and the fickleness of alliances. The empire he had built with such careful calculation was being torn apart, and the very foundations of the Boston underworld were being shaken in ways that would eventually lead to scandals far greater than any gambling indictment. For Howie Winter, the 10-year sentence was more than just a loss of freedom. It was a front row seat to the ruin of his legacy. The world that Howie Winter re-entered upon his release from prison in the late 1980s was a different universe from the one he had left a decade earlier. The city of Boston itself had changed, its skyline altered by new construction, its political landscape transformed. But the changes in the underworld were nothing short of seismic. He emerged as a man in his 60s, having surrendered a decade of his life to the system, only to find that the kingdom he had built was not just diminished, but utterly unrecognizable. The first and most profound shock would have been the full, public revelation of the cancer that had been eating away at his former organization, the devastating and sprawling scandal concerning James, Whitey, Bulger's role as a protected FBI informant. While Winter was in prison, the rumors had swirled, but upon his release, they were confirmed as stark, front-page news. The truth was now out in the open, a truth more corrosive than any lie, that his former subordinate, the man who had usurped his empire, had done so with the active protection of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He would have learned the sordid details of how Bulger and Flemmy, through their handler John Connolly, had been provided with intelligence that allowed them to eliminate rivals, evade prosecution, and consolidate power, all while pretending to be partners to Winter and others. The betrayal was not merely personal. It was a violation of the fundamental code by which Winter had lived his entire life. The very concept of loyalty, the bedrock of his criminal philosophy, had been exposed as a sham, perverted by the men he had trusted. The Winter Hill Gang, as he had known it, was extinct. It had been dismantled not by external pressure alone, but from within by this rot. The name itself was now synonymous not with his quiet, corporate style management, but with Bulger's brutal reign and the ensuing FBI corruption scandal that was rocking the city and leading to federal investigations, indictments, and a profound crisis of public trust. The landscape of power had also fragmented. With the old structure gone, new, more decentralized criminal elements had risen, often focused on the booming drug trade, an enterprise Winter had largely avoided. There was no throne to reclaim, no organization to rebuild. The players were different, the rules were different, and the relentless scrutiny from law enforcement was more intense than ever, now fueled by a desperate need for redemption after the Bulger embarrassment. For Howie Winter, this new world offered no place. He was a relic, a king without a country, a general whose army had been annihilated by treachery. The calm, strategic mind that had once orchestrated a regional criminal network now had to be applied to the much simpler and likely more humbling task of survival. He was an old, convicted felon, his name and reputation permanently etched in law enforcement files. Any attempt to re-enter a life of organized crime would have been immediately and aggressively targeted. The freedom he had regained was, in many ways, another form of confinement, bounded by the watchful eyes of the FBI and the Massachusetts State Police, who would have monitored his every move, waiting for him to make a mistake. The empire was dust. The alliances were broken. The code was shattered. He had outlived his own era, a fate that, for a man of his stature, was perhaps a more profound punishment than any prison sentence. The king had returned from exile to find his castle in ruins, his banners torn, and his name remembered not for the power he had wielded, but for the spectacular and corrupt downfall that followed his reign. The story of Howie Winter was, for all intents and purposes, already written in the history books, and the final chapters were being authored by the prosecutors who were now hunting the man who had betrayed him. The final decades of Howie Winter's life were a study in quiet diminishment, a long, slow sunset after a violently spectacular day. He returned to the greater Boston area, but he was now a ghost haunting the scenes of his former triumphs, a man forced to live in the shadow of his own legend. The practical realities of his existence would have been a stark contrast to his past. As a convicted felon, legitimate career paths were severely limited. The vast wealth he had accumulated from his criminal empire was likely largely depleted, seized by authorities, or spent on his legal defense and the cost of maintaining his life while incarcerated. He would have had to rely on the support of family, a few remaining loyal friends, and whatever small, quiet ventures he could manage under the radar. The constant surveillance was a given. His telephone would have been tapped, his movements documented, his associates identified and monitored. Any meeting he had would be photographed, any financial transaction scrutinized. For a man who prized his privacy and his ability to operate from the shadows, this perpetual spotlight would have been a special kind of hell, a constant reminder that he would never again know true freedom or autonomy. This period of his life was also marked by the long, grim, and very public unraveling of the world he had left behind. He lived as a spectator to the final acts of the Bulger saga, a drama that served as a grotesque coda to his own story. He saw John Connolly, the corrupt FBI agent, convicted and sent to prison for his role in the conspiracy. He watched as Stephen Flemmi, cut loose by the government, faced a slew of murder charges and began to cut his own deals, revealing more gruesome secrets in a desperate attempt to save himself. And most significantly, he witnessed the flight of James, Whitey, Bulger, who became one of America's most wanted fugitives, a specter whose legend grew with each passing year he evaded capture. For Winter, this must have been a source of immense and complex bitterness. Bulger, the betrayer, had not only destroyed Winter's legacy, but had then escaped the consequences for 16 long years, living a life on the run while Winter had dutifully served his time. The injustice of it, the sheer gall of it, would have been a festering wound. Yet, through it all, the public heard nothing from Howie Winter. There were no interviews, no memoirs, no public statements. He maintained his code of silence, the omert of the Boston Irish underworld, until the very end. This silence was his last vestige of power and dignity, while others like Flemmi were talking, spilling secrets to reduce their sentences. Winter remained closed-mouthed. He would not be a government witness. He would not explain himself to journalists. He would not justify his life or his actions to a world that could never truly understand the rules he lived by. This silence was profound. It was a final act of defiance, a refusal to let the system have the final word on his story. In his final years, he became an increasingly spectral figure, an old man whose name was whispered in connection with a bygone era of crime, a subject of fascination for true crime authors and historians, but a man who was personally removed from it all. He saw the city continue to change, the old neighborhoods gentrified, the social clubs replaced by trendy restaurants. The world that had created Howie Winter, the hardscrabble, tribal, and a fiercely loyal Somerville of the mid-century, had vanished as completely as his criminal empire. He was a living anachronism, a relic waiting to be catalogued. And through it all, the calm, observant demeanor that had defined him likely never left. He had outlived his rivals, his allies, and his empire. He had endured prison and the ultimate betrayal. He had watched his name become a footnote in the larger, more sensational story of Whitey Bulger. And as his health inevitably began to fail, he faced the final great equalizer, the one opponent against which no strategy, no alliance, and no amount of quiet power could ever prevail.
Howie?
Winter died on December 18, 2020, at the age of 91. His passing occurring not in a hail of gunfire, like so many of his contemporaries, but quietly. A final whisper from a man who had mastered the art of staying out of the spotlight. His death, coming in the midst of a global pandemic, was a subdued affair, a stark contrast to the violent and dramatic ends that had befallen so many figures from his world. He had outlived the era he defined, and in doing so, he achieved a kind of strange, somber victory simply by surviving. The obituaries that followed were a complex mixture of facts, legends, and the inevitable comparisons to the man whose shadow had come to define him in the public eye, Whitey Bulger. They recounted his rise from the streets of Somerville, his leadership of the Winter Hill Gang, his conviction, and his long silence. But his legacy is a complicated tapestry, one that cannot be understood through a simple list of his crimes. To truly assess Howie Winter is to see him as a transitional figure, the bridge between the old world, neighborhood-based gangsterism of the 1950s and the sophisticated, corporate-style racketeering that would define the late 20th century. He was not a psychopath like Bulger. His use of violence appears to have been, for the most part, strategic and business-oriented, a tool for enforcement rather than a source of pleasure. His great innovation was his approach to crime as a business. He was, in essence, a criminal entrepreneur who understood branding, market consolidation, and diversification long before these terms became corporate buzzwords. The Winter Hill Gang was itself a brand, one that commanded respect and fear. His consolidation of power after the Irish Gang War was a hostile takeover. His diversification into race, fixing, boxing, and labor racketeering was a strategy of vertical integration. He built a conglomerate, and he managed it from a nondescript auto body shop, showing a preference for profit over notoriety. This is what separates him in the historical narrative. He was the last of the old school bosses who believed in structure and discipline, and his removal from the scene directly created the vacuum that allowed a far more unpredictable and personally malicious criminal like Bulger to flourish. In many ways, Winter was the last check on Bulger's worst instincts. His legacy is therefore twofold. He is remembered for the empire he built, but also for the chaos that ensued after his fall. He is a cautionary tale about the limits of criminal power, no matter how intelligently it is wielded. He demonstrated that even the most carefully constructed illicit enterprise is ultimately fragile, vulnerable not only to external forces like federal law enforcement, but, more destructively, to the internal rot of betrayal and the uncontrollable ambitions of those within its ranks. His story is a Greek tragedy set in the streets of Somerville and Charlestown, where the hero's fatal flaw was perhaps his own code of loyalty, a code that he adhered to, but that was not reciprocated by all of his allies. He operated with a certain honor among thieves, a concept that became tragically obsolete in the new world of informants and federal deals. In the end, his life forces us to consider the very nature of power and legacy. He sought to build something lasting, something that would operate with the quiet efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. And for a time, he succeeded spectacularly. But because his empire was built on a foundation of illegality, it was always destined to crumble. The sands of shifting alliances, the relentless tide of federal investigations, and the earthquake of Bulger's betrayal ensured that his legacy would not be the empire itself, but its spectacular and instructive collapse. Howie Winter's story is not just a chapter in the history of Boston crime. It is a textbook on the rise and fall of power, a reminder that in the underworld, as in the legitimate world, the brightest flames often cast the longest and darkest shadows, and that sometimes the most powerful man in the room is the one who says the least, until history is finally forced to speak for him. The ripple effects of Howie Winter's life and criminal career extended far beyond the confines of the underworld, permanently altering the civic and legal fabric of Boston and leaving an indelible mark on the city's collective psyche. His reign, and particularly its aftermath, served as a dark and painful lesson for the community, a case study in how organized crime can fester when the lines between law enforcement and lawlessness become blurred. The most profound and damaging impact was, without question, the deep and lasting scar left by the FBI's corrupt relationship with Whitey Bulger. When that scandal finally erupted into public view, it did more than just send a few corrupt agents to prison. It shattered the public's trust in the very institutions sworn to protect them. For decades, the citizens of Boston, particularly in enclaves like South Boston and Somerville, had lived with the open secret of Bulger's power, wondering how he could operate with such impunity. The revelation that he was a protected FBI informant provided the horrifying answer. This wasn't just a failure of the system. It was an active betrayal by the system. The scandal fueled a pervasive and justified cynicism, a belief that the powerful were all corrupt, that justice was a commodity to be bought and sold, and that the city was merely a chessboard for games between hidden players. This loss of faith was one of Howie Winter's most significant, albeit unintended, legacies. His creation of the Winter Hill gang provided the structure that made Bulger a valuable asset to the FBI in the first place. Without Winter's consolidated enterprise, Bulger would have remained a local South Boston thug, not a key to dismantling the Italian mafia. Therefore, Winter's success indirectly created the conditions for the city's greatest modern law enforcement scandal. On a more practical level, his career forced a revolution in policing tactics. The traditional methods of dealing with street-level crime were useless against an organization like Winter's. His sophisticated, corporate model necessitated the use of new tools and new approaches. The investigation that finally brought him down relied heavily on the RICO Act, financial forensics, electronic surveillance, and the cultivation of insider witnesses. This became the new blueprint for combating organized crime, not just in Boston, but across the nation. prosecutors learned to follow the money, to target the organization as a whole rather than its individual soldiers, and to exploit the inherent tensions within criminal groups to turn members against each other. The Howie Winter prosecution was a graduate level course in building a complex conspiracy case, and the lessons learned were directly applied to the subsequent, even larger cases against the mafia and, eventually, against Bulger himself. Furthermore, his story became an integral thread in the rich and dark tapestry of Boston's mythology. The city has long been defined by its contrasts: the Brahmins and the ward bosses, the hallowed universities and the gritty neighborhoods, the freedom trail and the fugitive's hideout. Howie Winter embodies this contrast. He was a criminal kingpin who operated with the calm demeanor of a businessman, a man of violence who was remembered by many as quiet and polite. His life story adds a layer of grim authenticity to the city's identity, a reminder that its history is not all revolutionary war heroes and literary giants. He exists in the popular imagination alongside figures like Bulger and the fictional Frank Costello of The Departed, a symbol of a grittier, more dangerous, and somehow more authentic Boston that persists in memory even as the city gentrifies. His narrative feeds the enduring public fascination with the American gangster, a figure who lives by his own code and builds an empire through sheer force of will, a dark mirror of the entrepreneurial spirit the country holds so dear. Howie Winter was, in this sense, a classic American self-made man, but one who chose to build his fortune outside the law, and in doing so, he not only shaped his own destiny, but also helped shape the complex, often troubled, soul of the city he called home, leaving behind a legacy that is as much about the corruption he inadvertently exposed and the police work he inspired as it is about the crimes he committed. To understand the enduring fascination with a figure like Howie Winter, one must look past the criminal ledger and into the intricate psychology of the man himself, a composition of contrasts that defies easy categorization and challenges the stereotypical image of the loud, flashy gangster. At his core, Winter was a study in controlled duality, a man whose greatest strength was his ability to project an aura of unassuming normalcy, while simultaneously orchestrating a vast and ruthless criminal enterprise. His power did not radiate from him like heat from a fire. Rather, it was a gravitational pull, a quiet, unseen force that drew people into his orbit and commanded obedience without the need for constant demonstration. This was not an accident, but a carefully cultivated strategy. In a world populated by volatile personalities, quick, tempered enforcers, and egotistical braggarts, Winter's calm, observant silence made him the most dangerous man in the room. He was the listener, and in the underworld, the one who listens holds all the power, for he accumulates secrets, understands weaknesses, and calculates angles while others are busy talking. This psychological makeup suggests a man with immense emotional intelligence and a preternatural ability to read people, to understand what motivated them, whether it was greed, fear, or loyalty, and to leverage that knowledge with surgical precision. He was not a sociopath in the clinical sense, There are no accounts of him deriving pleasure from cruelty for its own sake. Instead, violence appears to have been, for him, a distasteful but necessary business expense, a tool to be used only when the balance sheet of power demanded it. This pragmatism is what separated him from a pure predator like Bulger. For Winter, murder was a failure of management, a sign that persuasion, intimidation, or financial incentive had not worked. This business, like approach to crime, required a profound separation of the personal from the professional, an ability to make cold, dispassionate decisions that would send men to their graves or to long prison sentences, all while maintaining the internal equilibrium to go home and live a seemingly normal life. This compartmentalization is one of the most telling aspects of his character. How does a man who orders a killing, or who profits from the misery of addicts and debtors, sleep at night? The answer likely lies in his worldview. He undoubtedly saw himself as a businessman operating in a sector that the government had irrationally chosen to outlaw. He provided a service, gambling loans, that was in high demand. In his mind, he was no different from a casino owner in Las Vegas or a bank, albeit one with a more direct collection department. This rationalization, this ability to frame his actions within a warped entrepreneurial framework, was the psychological shield that allowed him to function. Furthermore, his deep-seated code of loyalty, while ultimately his undoing in the face of Bulger's betrayal, was also a key component of his success. It created stability. Men knew where they stood with Howie Winter. If you were loyal and did your job, you were protected and rewarded. This reliability fostered a fierce devotion among his inner circle, a devotion that lasted long after his imprisonment. This contrasts sharply with the paranoia and capriciousness of Bulger's reign, where loyalty was a one-way street and allies could become targets on a whim. Winter's character was, therefore, perfectly suited to the specific time and place in which he operated. He was the right man for the job of consolidating the post-war Boston underworld, because he possessed the patience of a strategist, the mind of an accountant, and the cold heart of a CEO, all wrapped in the unthreatening package of a quiet neighbor from Somerville. He was the banality of evil incarnate, not in the sense of being a dull bureaucrat, but in the sense that his evil was not theatrical or melodramatic. It was efficient, administrative, and all the more pervasive because of it. He was not a monster who stood out in a crowd. He was the man next to you in the crowd, the one you would never suspect, and that made him, in the final analysis, the most formidable kind of criminal there is. The legend of Howie Winter is not built solely on court transcripts and FBI files, but also on the countless stories and anecdotes that circulated through the bars and social clubs of Somerville and beyond, tales that painted a more nuanced portrait of the man and the particular brand of power he wielded. These stories, whether entirely accurate or embellished by time, serve as parables that illustrate the unique rules of his underworld kingdom. One recurring theme in these accounts is his role as an arbitrator, a judge in the shadow justice system that operated parallel to the courts of the city. It was said that individuals with disputes, a fallen out between business partners, a quarrel over a debt, a perceived personal slight, would sometimes bring their case to Winter at Marshall's auto body. He would listen patiently to both sides, much like a judge hearing arguments, and then render a verdict. His decision was final, and it was enforced not necessarily through violence, but through the immense authority he commanded. To defy a ruling from Howie Winter was to place oneself outside the protection and the economy of the entire underworld, a risk few were willing to take. This role cemented his position as not just a gang leader, but as a de facto governing authority, a man who could impose order where the official law could not reach. Another set of stories highlights his famous aversion to the drug trade, particularly heroin, which was beginning to flood American cities in the later years of his reign. The legend goes that Winter imposed a strict ban on dealing heroin within his territory, not out of any moral objection, but for purely pragmatic business reasons. He understood that hard drugs brought a level of heat from law enforcement that gambling and loansharking did not. Drug addicts were unreliable, and the trade itself was chaotic and attracted a different, more desperate kind of criminal element that could destabilize his carefully managed operations. It is said that the punishment for violating this ban was severe, even fatal. This policy, whether apocryphal or not, became a key part of his legend, setting him apart from the next generation of gangsters who would build their empires almost entirely on narcotics. It painted a picture of a man with a code, a criminal with limits. There are also tales that speak to his personal demeanor, stories that underscore the disconnect between his mild exterior and his fearsome reputation. He was known to be unfailingly polite, well-dressed, and soft-spoken. He didn't curse loudly or cause scenes. He could be seen in neighborhood restaurants, a quiet man eating his meal, someone you would never look at twice. This normalcy was his camouflage, and it was perfect. The most chilling stories are often those that involve his quietest moments. It is said that when he was angry, he didn't raise his voice. He would become even quieter, his words more measured. And the silence that followed a simple statement was more terrifying than any shouted threat. This ability to command fear through stillness is a trait of a very specific kind of leader. These anecdotes collectively build the mythology of Howie Winter as the gentleman gangster, the boss who ruled with his mind rather than his fists, the arbiter of disputes, and the enforcer of a twisted but consistent code of conduct. They create a figure who is somehow more understandable and perhaps even more respectable in a warped way than a purely psychotic killer. This mythology, however, should not be allowed to whitewash the reality of his crimes. The loans he provided came with exorbitant interest rates that crippled families and led to unimaginable pressure and fear. The gambling operations preyed on addiction and broke lives. The violence, while strategic, was still brutal and final. The legend of the quiet, reasonable kingpin is a seductive one, but it is a legend built on a foundation of human suffering that he directly facilitated and profited from. The stories make him fascinating, but they should not make him sympathetic. They are the folklore of a criminal empire, tales told about the boss who brought order to the chaos, while quietly orchestrating a different kind of chaos of his own, one that was simply better managed, more profitable, and hidden behind a veneer of calm respectability until the very moment the prison gates closed behind him. The world that Howie Winter left behind upon his death was one where the sprawling, interconnected criminal empire he had presided over had long since been scattered to the winds, its key players meeting fates that ranged from the violently dramatic to the quietly ignominious, each story a final, grim postscript to the era he defined. The dissolution of the Winter Hill Gang was not a single event, but a slow, painful unraveling that played out over decades, a process of attrition through prison, betrayal, and death. The most notorious of his associates, James Whitey Bulger, finally saw his own legend crumble into dust after 16 years as one of the FBI's most wanted. Living a life on the run that itself became the stuff of morbid folklore, he was captured in Santa Monica, California in 2011, an old and frail man hidden away in a rent-controlled apartment. His subsequent trial was a media circus, a cathartic and long, overdue public reckoning that laid bare the full extent of his depravity, detailing his involvement in 11 murders among countless other crimes. The image of the dashing Robin Hood-like figure that some in South Boston had clung to was permanently shattered, replaced by the reality of a cold-blooded, narcissistic killer who had used and been used by the FBI. In 2018, shortly after being transferred to a federal prison in West Virginia, Bulger was brutally murdered by other inmates, a fittingly violent and sordid end for a man whose life was defined by violence and sordid deals. His partner, Stephen, the rifleman, Flemmy, having avoided Bulger's fugitive fate, chose a different path: cooperation. In a desperate bid to avoid the death penalty, Flemmy turned government witness, and in doing so, he became the definitive chronicler of the gang's darkest secrets. It was Flemmy who provided detailed confessions to a string of murders. It was Flemmy who laid out the intricate mechanics of the relationship with the FBI, and it was Flemmy who, from the witness stand, implicated everyone he had ever worked with. His testimony was instrumental in convicting not only Bulger, but also the corrupt FBI agent John Connolly, and in closing countless cold case files. For Flemmy, the price of his continued existence was to become the ultimate pariah, a man who violated the code he had once lived by, now spending his life in prison as a snitch, a fate that Howie Winter would have considered worse than death. Other lieutenants and foot soldiers met less public, but equally final ends. Some died of old age while still under the watchful eye of the law, never having fully escaped the long shadow of their past. Others served long prison sentences and emerged as broken old men, their best years spent behind bars, returning to a world that had no place for them. The physical landmarks of Winter's empire vanished too. Marshall's auto body, the once impregnable nerve center of New England crime, is long gone, the site likely now occupied by a condominium or a trendy cafe, with no plaque to mark the history that transpired there. The social clubs where deals were struck have been shuttered. The old neighborhood haunts replaced by establishments catering to a new, more affluent population that has little connection to the city's gritty past. The organized, corporate-style crime syndicate that Winter built fractured into smaller, more decentralized groups, often focused on the international drug trade or cybercrime. Operations that lack the neighborhood roots and the quasi-feudal structure of the old gang. The story of the Winter Hill Gang, from its bloody rise in the Irish Gang War to its corrosive demise in the Bulger scandal, now exists primarily in books, documentary films, and the fading memories of an older generation. It is a closed chapter in the history of American crime. Howie Winter outlived almost all of it, a silent witness to the total and utter destruction of everything he had built, a king who lived long enough to see his kingdom not just conquered, but erased from the map, its legacy one of ruin, betrayal, and a cautionary tale about the inevitable price of a life lived outside the law. To fully appreciate the unique place that Howie Winter and the Winter Hill Gang occupy in the annals of American crime, one must step back from the specific streets of Somerville and view their story within the wider tapestry of 20th century organized crime, a landscape dominated by the iconic, yet structurally different, Italian mafia. The Winter Hill Gang was a fascinating anomaly, a powerful, non-Italian syndicate that not only survived but thrived in the shadow of the mafia's national network. And its distinct characteristics highlight the diverse ecosystems of the American underworld. The most obvious distinction was one of ethnicity and culture. While the mafia, or La Cosa Nostra, was built on a foundation of Sicilian and Southern Italian traditions, with its rigid hierarchies, initiation rituals, and deep-seated codes of silence and honor imported from the old country. The Winter Hill Gang was a product of the Irish, American urban experience. It was less formal, more pragmatic, and its structure was fluid, operating more like a board of directors for a criminal corporation than a traditional crime family with a boss, underboss, and capos. Winter was the chairman of the board, a first among equals who led through consensus and calculated authority rather than absolute, ritualized fealty. This lack of formal structure was arguably a source of its strength, allowing for flexibility and adaptability that the more hidebound mafia families often lacked. Another key difference lay in their operational focus. The mafia, particularly the five families of New York, had their hands in a vast array of criminal ventures, but they were famously, and often disastrously, involved in narcotics despite official prohibitions. The Winter Hill Gang, under Winter's leadership, famously avoided hard drugs, seeing them as a liability that attracted undue police attention and destabilized the workforce. This allowed Winter to maintain a lower profile and to project an image, however illusory, of a criminal with a code. Their specialty was the gentleman's vice of gambling, and their innovation was in taking this ancient trade and systematizing it on an industrial scale, creating a regional betting apparatus that was as efficient as any legal business. This focus made them incredibly wealthy, without the same level of violent chaos that often accompanied the drug trade. Furthermore, their relationship with law enforcement took a uniquely dark turn. While corruption was endemic in many cities, and the mafia certainly had its share of bought cops and judges, the Winter Hill Gang's experience was defined by the top-down institutional corruption of the FBI itself. The deal between Bulger, Flemmy, and the Bureau was not a simple case of a dirty cop on the take. It was a strategic, though morally bankrupt, alliance where the gang's leaders were formally enlisted as assets of the federal government. This gave them a protected status that was unprecedented, allowing them to wage war on their rivals, including the mafia, with virtual impunity. This dynamic created a bizarre triangle of power in Boston: the Italian mafia, the Irish Winter Hill Gang, and the FBI, all locked in a covert war, where the boundaries between hunter and prey were deliberately and corruptly blurred. In this sense, the Winter Hill Gang was a precursor to a more modern, hybrid form of criminality, one that could exploit the weaknesses and corruptible elements of the very system designed to destroy it. When compared to other non-Italian criminal organizations, like the Jewish syndicates of murder, Incorporated, or the diverse crews of the American Midwest, the Winter Hill Gang stands out for its longevity and its deep, localized control. They weren't just hitmen for hire or loose confederations of bootleggers. They were a governing criminal force that embedded itself into the economic and social fabric of an entire region for decades. Howie Winter's legacy, therefore, is not just that of a successful gangster, but of the architect of a uniquely American criminal enterprise, one that was corporate in its structure, pragmatic in its operations, and devastatingly effective in its corruption, to the old world traditions of the mafia, and a dark mirror to the legitimate capitalist spirit that defined the nation in the post-war era. The relentless pursuit and eventual dismantling of the Winter Hill Gang under Howie Winter served as a brutal but invaluable training ground for federal law enforcement war era, forcing a paradigm shift in tactics and legal strategy that would forever change how the United States government confronted sophisticated organized crime. The traditional methods of policing, relying on street-level arrests, responding to individual acts of violence, and hoping to flip a low-level informant, were utterly useless against an organization that was structured like a corporation and led by a man who embodied the quiet efficiency of a chief executive officer. The failure of these conventional approaches necessitated innovation, and the investigation into Winter became a crucible where new, more powerful weapons were forged and tested. The most significant of these was the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. While not created specifically for Winter, his prosecution became a textbook example of its application. Prior to RICO, prosecutors were forced to try gangsters on discrete, individual crimes: a single murder, a specific gambling operation, an isolated act of extortion. This was like trying to destroy a mighty oak tree by plucking its leaves one by one. Winter's lawyers could easily isolate these charges, often pinning them on underlings while the leadership remained insulated. RICO changed the game entirely. It allowed prosecutors to present the entire criminal enterprise as a single, continuing conspiracy. The bookmaking, the loan sharking, the race fixing, the acts of violence, they were no longer separate crimes, but interconnected threads in a single, illegal tapestry. This holistic approach was devastatingly effective. It allowed the government to demonstrate the sheer scale and menace of the organization, and it carried severe penalties, including extended prison sentences and the forfeiture of all assets derived from the criminal enterprise. Alongside this legal revolution came a tactical one in investigative technique. To build a RICO case, you needed an overwhelming volume of evidence, and that required a move from reactive policing to proactive, long-term intelligence gathering. The FBI launched sweeping electronic surveillance operations, planting bugs in the gang's headquarters at Marshall's Auto Body and tapping their phones. Agents spent thousands of hours in surveillance cars, photographing and logging every visitor, every meeting, every cash drop. They became forensic accountants, tracing the complex flow of money through shell companies and front businesses, following the digital paper trail that Winter had been so careful to create. This financial investigation was as crucial as the evidence of violence. It proved the profit motive that drove the entire conspiracy. Furthermore, the strategy of cultivating informants was elevated to a high art. Faced with the daunting structure of the gang, prosecutors used the threat of long RICO sentences to flip members from the inside out. They started with the periphery, the sheet writers, the money couriers, the low-level bookmakers, and used their testimony to apply pressure on the tier above them, creating a domino effect of cooperation that slowly worked its way toward the core leadership. This method, however, also contained the seeds of the future scandal. As the desperation for high-level informants led agents like John Connolly to cross ethical and legal lines, protecting their prized assets Bulger and Flemmy from the very scrutiny they were applying to others. The painful lessons learned from this corruption itself led to another wave of reform. Stricter oversight of FBI informant programs, better internal controls, and a renewed emphasis on ethical boundaries, even in the dirty business of fighting crime. In essence, the war against Howie Winter was the birth of modern, white-collar style prosecution applied to blue-collar crime. It taught law enforcement that to defeat a corporate enemy, you had to act like a corporate raider, conducting hostile takeovers through financial pressure, internal espionage, and strategic legal maneuvering. The conviction of Howie Winter was not just a victory, it was a proof of concept. It demonstrated that no criminal enterprise, no matter how intelligent its leader or how sophisticated its operations, was beyond the reach of a determined, well-resourced, and legally empowered government. The playbook written in the courtrooms of Boston was then used to decimate the mafia families in New York, Chicago, and across the country, leading to a golden age of organized crime prosecutions in the 1980s and 1990s. In a profound irony, Howie Winter, the man who sought to bring business like order to the underworld, ultimately provided the case study that taught the government how to business, like in its destruction of that very world. The journey of Howie Winter from the stark reality of a federal prison cell to the stylized of popular culture is a fascinating metamorphosis, one that reveals as much about our society's fascination with the outlaw figure as it does about the man himself in the decades since his peak. The story of the Winter Hill Gang and the Boston underworld has been mined for content in a myriad of books, films, and television shows, each iteration shaping and often distorting the legacy of its key players to fit narrative conventions. Howie Winter, however, has largely remained a secondary character in these dramatizations, a spectral presence lurking in the background, while more flamboyant figures like Whitey Bulger take center stage. This is perhaps the final irony of his life. The man who valued silence and anonymity above all else has been granted a form of it, even in the glaring spotlight of popular media. When he does appear, he is often portrayed as the calm, elder statesman of crime, the voice of reason and tradition in a world descending into chaos. This portrayal is not entirely inaccurate. It captures his strategic mind and his preference for order, but it also risks romanticizing him, softening the edges of a man who presided over a vast and violent criminal enterprise. The complexity of his character, the quiet businessman who could authorize a murder, the neighborhood guy who crippled families with usurious loans, is often lost, simplified into the archetype of the last real gangster. The most famous cultural touchstone for this era is undoubtedly Martin Scorsese's film, The Departed, a masterpiece of tension that, while set in Boston and featuring a corrupt FBI agent and a ruthless Irish gang, is a work of fiction loosely inspired by the Bulger saga. In that film, the character of Frank Costello, played with feral intensity by Jack Nicholson, is a composite, drawing heavily on Bulger's psychotic volatility rather than Winter's calculated calm. The real Howie Winter was no Frank Costello. He lacked the theatrical menace, the almost demonic presence. A more accurate, though still dramatized, portrayal can be found in the lesser known but critically acclaimed film, Black Mass, which focuses specifically on Bulger. In it, the actor John Douglas Thompson plays Howie Winter with a quiet, understated authority that feels much closer to the truth. A man who speaks softly but commands immense respect. A man who is deeply uncomfortable with Bulger's rising recklessness. Yet, even here, he is a supporting player in Bulger's story. This reflects a broader cultural trend. We are drawn to the monstrous, the charismatic, the explosively violent. The quiet strategist, the corporate-minded CEO of crime, is a harder character to dramatize, his power less visible, and therefore less cinematic. Our myths about gangsters are built on a foundation of action, not deliberation. We want to see the shootout, not the hours of accounting that paid for the guns. This is why Whitey Bulger, with his chilling grin and his trail of bodies, has become an American folk devil, while Howie Winter remains a footnote for crime enthusiasts. The reality, of course, is that without Winter's structure, there would have been no platform for Bulger's ascent. Winter built the stage. Bulger simply delivered the most shocking performance. The books and documentaries that strive for nonfiction accuracy do better justice to Winter's central role, but they too must grapple with his elusive nature. He left behind no memoir, no confessional interviews. He is a silhouette defined by the actions of his organization and the recollections of others, many of whom have their own agendas. The cultural image of Howie Winter is therefore a palimpsest, an image written over by time media and the overwhelming shadow of his betrayer. He has become a symbol of a lost era of criminal conduct, a benchmark against which the anarchy that followed is measured. But the true man, the quiet boy from Somerville who used his intellect to build an empire and his code to navigate it, remains frustratingly, and perhaps appropriately, just out of focus, a ghost in the machine of his own legend, his silence echoing louder than any line of movie dialogue ever could. And so we arrive at the final reckoning, the moment to step back from the intricate details of criminal enterprises and law enforcement strategies to contemplate the broader, more universal themes woven throughout the life and legacy of Howard Winter. His story transcends the specific geography of Boston and the particular details of racketeering. It is a timeless parable about the nature of power, the fragility of legacy, and the inescapable physics of a criminal life where for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, often arriving years later with the force of a tidal wave. The central theme of his life was power, not the loud, performative power of the tyrant, but the quiet, pervasive power of the administrator. He understood that true, lasting control was not exercised through fear alone, but through a combination of dependency, loyalty, and the silent, unshakable certainty of consequences. He built a system where people depended on him for their vices, for their loans, for the resolution of their disputes, and in doing so, he wove his influence into the very fabric of daily life for countless individuals. This was a power that was felt rather than seen, a power that made him more akin to a force of nature than a man, a predictable and reliable element in an otherwise chaotic world. And yet, this meticulously constructed power proved to be profoundly fragile. It was vulnerable not to a more powerful army, but to the slow, corrosive drip of betrayal from within and the relentless, patient pressure of the state from without. His legacy is thus a deeply contradictory one. He is remembered as the man who brought order, the corporate visionary of the underworld. Yet his most enduring impact was the chaos that erupted in his absence. He is the architect whose greatest building collapsed so spectacularly that it became a warning to all future architects. His life forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that in the pursuit of power outside the boundaries of law, one inevitably sows the seeds of one's own destruction. The alliances he forged, like the one with Bulger, contained the very venom that would eventually poison his entire empire. The sophistication of his operations created the detailed records that would become the evidence for his conviction. The code of loyalty he lived by was the very thing that left him vulnerable to those who did not share it. This is the tragic flaw of the criminal kingpins. To be successful, one must be intelligent, strategic, and disciplined. But those very qualities create an enterprise that is large and stable enough to attract the full, focused wrath of the government and to foster the bitter, ambitious rivalries that lead to betrayal. There is no happy retirement for a man like Howie Winter. No peaceful sunset years enjoying the fruits of his labor. The path he chose only leads to one of two destinations, a prison cell or a grave, and often, as in his case, it leads to both, with a long purgatorial period of exile in between. He achieved the American dream of rising from humble origins to command immense influence and wealth, but he did so through a mirror universe of that dream, one where the same ambition and intelligence that are celebrated in the legitimate world become the instruments of one's own ruin. His story is a somber reminder that a legacy is not defined by the height of one's rise, but by the totality of one's fall and by the wreckage left behind. Howie Winter's world is gone, not because the desire for gambling or illicit loans has vanished, but because the specific, neighborhood-based, quasi-feudal structure he represented could not survive the twin assaults of federal law enforcement and its own internal corruptions. He was the last of a kind, and his long life was a living monument to a vanished era, a man who carried the ghost of his own empire within him for decades, a king without a kingdom, a general without an army, his greatest victory merely being his survival, a hollow triumph that echoed in the silence of his final years. And so we close the book on Howard Winter, the boy from Somerville who became a king, the strategist who was outmaneuvered, the quiet man whose life story screams a cautionary tale across the decades. From the gritty streets of his youth to the corporate style criminal suite he commanded, from the bloody turf wars that cemented his power to the cold, sterile courtroom that stripped it away, his journey was an epic written not in ink, but in actions, alliances, and blood. We have traversed the entire landscape of his existence, from his calculated rise, building an empire on the vices and vulnerabilities of his city, to his long, slow downfall, orchestrated by the very laws he flouted and the betrayals he failed to foresee. We have seen his empire at its peak, a shadow government operating with chilling efficiency from a simple auto body shop, and we have witnessed its utter dissolution, a demise more total than any military defeat, leaving behind only stories, court transcripts, and graves. We have reflected on his complex character, a paradoxical blend of calm businessman and ruthless crime lord, a man who commanded fear through silence and built loyalty through a code that ultimately could not protect him. We have placed his story within the wider context of American crime, seeing him as a unique and transitional figure whose corporate model was both his greatest strength and his ultimate vulnerability. We have examined how his legacy is not merely a chapter in the history of Boston's underworld, but a permanent scar on its civic trust and a catalyst for revolutionary changes in law enforcement. And we have seen how his life, stripped of its romanticized mythology, serves as a stark lesson on the inescapable gravity of a criminal path. a path that may offer shortcuts to power and wealth, but whose final destination is always, inevitably, ruin. The rise and fall of Howie Winter is more than just a true crime story. It is a profound meditation on the very nature of power, ambition, and legacy. It demonstrates that power built on sand, no matter how impressive the structure, cannot withstand the tides of time, justice, and human treachery. His life asks us a simple, haunting question. What is the price of a legacy, and is any empire worth building if its very foundation guarantees its destruction? The story you have just experienced was pieced together from a multitude of sources: FBI files, court documents, historical records, and the accounts of those who were there, all with the singular goal of presenting you with the most accurate and comprehensive narrative possible. Its purpose is not to glorify the life of crime, but to illuminate its true, grim reality, to inform, and to provide a clear-eyed perspective on a complex piece of American history. If this journey into the shadowy world of Howie Winter and the Winter Hill Gang held your attention, if it provided you with a deeper understanding of this dark chapter, then our objective has been met. The pursuit of knowledge about our past, even its most troubled corners, is what allows us to understand our present and shape our future. This is where our part of the story ends, but the conversation can continue. Your engagement gives these historical events meaning in the modern day. Therefore, we now pass the narrative to you. If you found this deep dive compelling, we would be immensely grateful if you would share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what aspect of this saga you found most shocking, most surprising, or most thought-provoking. Your perspective enriches the story for everyone. Furthermore, if you believe this kind of meticulous, long-form historical storytelling has value, please support this channel by liking this video, subscribing for more detailed explorations of forgotten histories and complex figures, and sharing it with others who share your interest. By clicking that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell, you ensure you won't miss our next journey into the intricate tapestry of the past. We are committed to bringing you more content that is not only engaging, but also meticulously researched and thoughtfully presented. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your commitment to understanding the full, unvarnished story. The history is now yours to carry forward.